Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Vintage Books Live. Tonight we have William Erickson with us, who is a poet, and I believe the book that just came out, which is called You Don't Have to Believe in the World, is fourth publication.
It's my first full-length collection. Yeah, I have roughly three chapbooks. I have two like regular traditional chapbooks and then one that is actually an octavo, so it's letterpressed on like a big tabloid size
Oh,
sheet
okay.
and
Yeah.
then folded
Oh,
up
fun.
a bunch of
Is that the
times.
one that's not in the store yet?
Yes,
Okay. Okay.
it's actually I found this out a couple weeks ago and it was really crazy, but it's sold out.
Oh, yay. Oh,
So
that's fantastic.
it doesn't even exist anymore until we do another print run, if we
Yeah,
do another
yeah.
print run. So
That's
really,
that's pretty awesome though. That's a fun problem to have because it's like,
right?
yeah, that means people liked it and they did good.
Yeah, I was
Um,
like, "Nuh-uh, you're lying to me."
well, I mean, I'm gonna ask all the normal questions in a minute, but one thing that I was thinking about today, and I have to warn both you and the audience that I'm gonna be a little bit all over the place because we had such a big release day today that I was still shelving books about 5 minutes before I had to leave, and I didn't get to sit down like I normally do and write down all my questions ahead of time. So, but something that I've been thinking about is I think I know the answer to this, but I have never actually asked anybody. What's the formal difference between a book length work and a chapbook? Is it just length or are there other differences?
I mean, I suppose technically and according to like the publishing industry, it's probably just length. Although I don't really see a lot of actual consensus. Like I've seen 50-page books published as chapbooks, and I've seen 40-page books published as full-length
Yeah.
collections. I tend to think of a chapbook as kind of um, like a concise project. So for me, a chapbook is going to be a lot more um, purpose oriented. There's going to be like a lot more coherent aboutness from beginning to end.
Okay. Okay.
Um, they feel more like projects, whereas like a full length collection, for me anyway, a lot of times, well, I have one full length collection, so I can't really say a lot of times, but as I'm putting together full length manuscripts,
Yeah.
I'm like pulling poems from, big stacks of work that has developed over kind of a certain period of time and trying to figure out where the coherence is between those rather than having like, a series poem where it's all kind of about the same thing or in the same neighborhood. That's what the difference feels like to me. I would
Okay.
imagine you'd
So
probably get
maybe
as many different answers
yeah,
as
I'm
times that you'd
sure.
ask it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
But in your mind, is the chapbook a little bit more sort of like one coherent theme,
Yes.
whereas the collection might be like different themes throughout or
Yes. Yeah.
okay.
I
Okay.
mean, I feel like just kind of just by dint of the size, but also for me, sort of the genre of the book, like the full length collection will inherently kind of just contain more.
Yeah.
Whereas a chapbook, like you might be driving really hard on like one particular theme or like one particular bit of commentary or mode of writing or something like that, where it's like really true all the way through and identifiable. Um, I don't know. That's just me.
No, I mean that feels reasonable. I mean that feels kind of like what we've seen in the store, but we don't have a
Yeah.
huge collection in the
Yeah.
store either of new work. We've got a lot of, like we've
Yeah.
got a lot of used
Yeah.
and classic poetry and that kind of thing, but we don't have a ton of new work. And
Yeah.
so can you talk a little bit about the book that just came out relatively recently in the last few months, and kind of how that came to be and what some of the themes are that you play around with and
Um, yeah, so it was a kind of a process of looking at a lot of poems that came out over a course of time, maybe 4 years, 3 years kind of worth of poems where I'm writing in kind of a particular mode. Um, and the manuscript itself started as probably 200 pages or 200 poems or something like that. And I know for sure it's not going to end up being that, but
Yeah.
trying to see like where the dance moves are in between the poems and from one poem to the other and one section to the other. Um, and then something that was really difficult for me was like trying to find the structure that can hold it all. Um, I feel like you can almost arbitrarily like throw poems into a manuscript and call it a book. Um, but I feel like what sets apart just sort of a hodgepodge of poems across time and like a book is the the scaffolding that sort of sits in between and around all the poems. And that was a really difficult thing for me to wrangle with. And I ended up actually um, stealing an idea from a friend of mine. But I had all these, it's like a series poem or a series of poems that were little inventions, like goofy little inventions. And I used those as interstitials in between sections of poems and sort of let those carry one theme into the next theme and into the next theme. Um, the book itself, I feel like in a really tangible, excuse me, in a really tangible way for me, deals with death, the death of family members, the death of my sister. In particular, there's a lot of like recurring characters and um, animals that come up, and I feel like in a lot of ways those embody the people that I've lost or like versions of selves that I'm mourning or longing for or grieving or something. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to sort of wrap my language around like an aboutness in
Yeah.
my work. I feel like other people are better at doing that about, someone else's work than um,
I think there's easier when you have some distance to analyze.
right, right,
It
right.
sounds like honestly when you take that big giant thing of poems and then you think about how to arrange it in a piece, it sounds like in a way that's an act of poetry in and of itself because you're choosing the order and the spacing and what comes after another and what gets grouped together. It's like you kind of create a larger creative work with a bunch of smaller creative works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And there's like a lot of intuition involved, or at least for me, there's a lot of intuition. Like, this poem feels right sitting next to, in between these two poems.
Yeah.
Um, and I can't really put a finger on why, excuse me,
Yeah.
on why exactly that is, but like it feels right. And so, yeah, it was like there was a lot of just kind of vibes happening
Yeah. Yeah.
um to get to the end result, which like I don't know, I still feel like there's probably more good ways to arrange a manuscript than bad ways, so you can almost just sort of shuffle stuff
Yeah.
around and figure out what's happening.
Well, I
It's
feel
not your
like it's
dreams.
probably the same as if you're writing a piece of fiction and you're deciding like what how a scene's going to unfold or what scene comes before what scene or like when are you going to introduce this character or that character, like when are you going to wait because it's more dramatic or there's a lot of it like you can analyze later, like as
Hmm.
somebody analyzing your work can say, oh, look what this person did here and they chose to do this because this, and yet when you're doing it there's just so much more like heart and feel to it. I
Yeah,
I always used to laugh when I was doing my lit major because you'd write a piece of work and you'd bring it to class and everybody would talk about it and you'd read it and then everybody would analyze it and stuff, and there were times when people would say, "Oh, it sounds like you were really sad when you wrote this," and blah 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 blah, and you go, "Oh, hey, I was, I guess," but and you don't think about the fact that something's coming through that you didn't even think about. But there were other times where somebody would be like, "Oh, well, I can see that this and this was happening, and you meant to do this, and this is symbolism for this," and it's like, I just thought the cow was cute.
right?
So
Yeah,
it's, so much of it is just to feel when you're doing
yeah.
it that,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's yeah. I always get like I both clam up and get a kick out of when people are talking about my poetry in like a workshop setting or something, and someone is like, "Well, why did you make this decision to put this line break here, and like, how did you come to the conclusion that this enjambment was like the right thing, and blah blah blah?" And I'm like, "Because I did. It's
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. I wasn't like I didn't have like a little poetry calculator." On the side, like, figuring
What?
out the
You
right
don't have a
moves or
little
whatever.
poetry cactus? I'm
I wish
so
I did, but
disappointed.
yeah, I wish I did.
That would make life a lot easier, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
right. New invention.
Yeah, exactly. So I am recording. You probably heard the little thing say, "You are now recording." Something's up with YouTube and it keeps telling me that there's a problem. So we are may or may not be actually streaming on YouTube. And so I thought, well, I'll just record it here too. That way we'll have pieces of it at least that we can use. But that's why that popped on there. Um, I am really curious how one thing that I was thinking about is the first time that we talked way back, I don't even remember. Um, right around the time that Monotonies of the Wildlife came out. I think it was a couple
Yeah,
months after, because I think you had
yeah,
written to us right before it came out, and then
right,
I didn't get back to you right away, but so by the time we chatted, it had been a couple months out.
right, right.
And I remember talking to you about it, and it was hard for you to talk about because, you had this poetry book come out, but it was all poems that you had written, way before,
Yeah,
and, you were on to different work. Does
yeah,
that continue to be weird that
yeah,
you write a piece of work and by the time you're talking about it, you're on to another? I feel like I've experienced that in writing, nonfiction. I've talked to people who have experienced that writing fiction, but I feel like that it would be really even more profound with poetry because it comes from such a place of personal and emotional experience that inevitably by the time you're talking about it, you're going to be in a different place.
right. Yeah. I mean, it's for me, it remains to be deeply uncomfortable. The book that I had just came out in I guess it was May. Um, the poems there are maybe at the most recent 3 years old by now. Um,
Oh,
and at
wow.
the oldest, like five or
Yeah.
six. And so it's like the same problem,
Yeah.
exactly with monotonies. And I read them, and one, I don't necessarily identify with them. I mean, a me identified with them at some point, and that me is still
Yeah.
tangible, in some form. So like I do, and I guess they're like sort of like a memory. But the thing that really, I think bothers me about it pretty consistently is that I grow less excited,
Yeah.
because like
Yeah.
I'm way more excited about poems I'm writing now,
Yeah.
um, and really super bored with poems that I wrote, 3 years ago. And like I think hierarchically about it too. So like I think that poems I'm writing now are better, They're probably not, um, they're certainly newer and fresher, and so adding to that better feeling. But then I go back to like, poems in this book that are 5 years old, and I'm like, eh, I'm just kind of meh
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
them. And so yeah, it's weird. You want everything to move faster, but also like assembling a manuscript out of poems that are brand new and fresh, like you're gonna miss stuff because you're excited
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
language and you're still really close to the poems and you don't know them yet, and that you don't exactly know like what kinds of things you're touching on. Um, I don't know. It's a catch 22, I think.
Was it was the act of putting the book together, did that help you appreciate some of the older stuff? Again, a little bit because you had to assemble it into a larger creative piece. And so each poem's playing a role in that larger piece. Did that
I
make
think
them seem
so.
more relevant again or
I think so. I think I think that happened, but I don't think I noticed it until I
yeah,
actually had the book. And then when I had the book in hand, I was like, oh, okay, I can like some of these I can dig and like in this new context that feels completely different. And now like at a greater remove from
yeah,
me because now
yeah,
someone else has had a bunch of hands on it and they did a bunch of stuff with it and glued it together or whatever. I feel like I can come at it with that kind of a distance,
yeah, yeah.
um, where I couldn't before. But yeah,
Yeah, because I know I experienced that to some extent too, although there are times where I feel like I have for surely written the worst thing imaginable and come back to it a little bit later and go, "Oh, I guess this was okay."
yeah, yeah,
So,
right,
uh,
right.
sometimes a little distance is a good thing.
Yeah, right. And a friend of mine told me when I was complaining to him about this whole scenario, and his thing was like, and he's published a bajillion books, and his thing is like, well, that journey is exciting to you when you were doing it. Like the poems, when you wrote them, you were excited about them. Now you're not, but you were at some point. And a person who's reading your work, who's coming to that bit of work for the first
Yeah,
time, is experiencing that same excitement and they're going to follow that journey. They're 45 steps behind you, but they're
yeah,
making that
yeah,
same journey if they continue to read and like it or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like I try to keep that in mind, but it's a very
yeah,
difficult thing to keep in
yeah,
mind.
yeah. No, I mean, I think I poetry is such a distillation that it feels like it would be a little bit more profoundly felt with poetry than maybe with prose.
Hmm.
And not because they don't have beautiful, wonderful things to do, but just because they're a different craft that I feel like whatever you feel with prose, like you're gonna, just like everything else, you're gonna take it and distill it down a little bit more. So,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
but
Yeah, and I think too, I noticed this with prose writers too, but maybe not as much. Like stylistically, I tend to change over time a lot. Like I'll move out of one mode of writing aesthetically and into a completely different mode of writing aesthetically, and I kind of abandon the previous mode.
yeah,
Like I can't step into a way of writing that I was doing 3 years ago or
yeah,
even
yeah,
1 year ago. So I feel like my voice changes really dramatically from kind of like phase to phase, I guess. And it makes me uncomfortable to go back into
yeah.
those older phases and like
Doesn't feel
engage
like
with that
you
work.
anymore. And yeah.
Yeah, right, right. It's very strange.
How, what does that mean in practical terms? Like to someone who's not a poet and doesn't write poetry, like when you say the work changes, can you talk a little bit about that? Like what, is it more like practical things like how you actually construct the poem or just like tone?
Yes and yes. Like,
Okay.
yeah, so like the poems in this book that just came out, like a lot of them tend to be um a bit more narrative. I would still say that they're like, surrealist, blah 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 kinds of poems. But there's sort of more of like the glue that holds the language together and moves the language, from one logical thing to the next logical thing to the next logical thing. Like you could almost construct a narrative. Um, in work that I was doing a year ago, um, there was almost none of that connective tissue. So like really fragmented, also fragmented on the page. So like I was working with Seishura, so like big dramatic breaks in the text and gaps in the text and lots and lots of white space and like fragmentation and
Fun.
modularity and like mixing
Yeah.
stuff around. And so yeah, like my diction changes, um, or the diction of the poems, um, tone changes, even the way that they appear on the page for me changes. Like I'm working on sonnets now. Now I've been writing sonnets for like 3 months or 6 months or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel inconsistent, but at the same
Yeah.
time, I
Yeah.
feel like I'm just kind of, walking along the
Do
path as
you,
it changes.
so you've been at this for a little bit now. Do you find that is there any like aspect that you've cycled back to? Like not
Hmm.
a wholesale form or style, but like pieces of something you used before. Like I don't want to do it exactly that way before, but I want to come back to and revisit something about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that a thing that I like to return to with some kind of regularity, like maybe in a sense I'm doing it in stuff that I'm writing now, is kind of like a sort of childish spookiness that kind of relies on a simplicity of the language and kind of a naivety of the language. And like I was doing similar stuff to that in You Don't Have to Believe in the World, and I feel like I'm starting to dip back into that again, and it's kind of a thing that I recurringly kind of dip
Yeah,
back
yeah,
into and then move back out of. So yeah, I think that there's things that I return to, and I'm sure that you could look at stuff that I'm working on now and see that it's the same writer. But like when I look at it, I'm like, that's a
yeah, yeah. It would be
totally
really
different.
interesting to have somebody else look at it and say,
Right, right.
here's the through lines that I see,
Hmm.
even though it does change dramatically from one
Right,
to the other. And
right, yeah. Right. And like I joke, but like I tell people that I'm just I've always been writing like the same poem over and over in different ways. And I still feel very much
yeah,
like that. And so I think that that probably comes through in one sense or another, in the writing itself, but I don't know. I wouldn't be able
you
to
think
see it.
that's true of a lot of poets, a lot of writers that were kind of
Hmm.
telling the same story or the same themes over and over again, just in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just thinking about like other different writers that I like and how, they might write completely different genres or whatever, but there's going to be themes that are there. Like even if they try to write something drastically different and do a good job of it, a lot of times there'll still be some of those themes that they obviously care about that will
Yeah,
pop up,
right. Yeah.
somehow.
The
Yeah.
example that pops into my head is I'm a big George Saunders fan. Really big George Saunders fan. And like I kind of feel like he writes the same collections of short stories like repeatedly with different sets of characters and with different language. And then he came out with like Lincoln in the Bardo, and Lincoln in the Bardo is like wildly different than anything he'd ever done, formally and thematically and everything. And I was like expecting to be blown away by this like brand new George Saunders, and it's like I'm like this is a really fantastic book, but it's just this is George Saunders, like
Yeah. Yeah.
this is the same as Civil War Land in Bad Decline or whatever
Yeah.
other book he came out with, even though it's so completely different. So
Yeah.
I think that that's true in a sense. Like I feel like all of us kind of circulate around the same core pillars of things, and just come at them from different angles all the
Yeah.
time.
Do you think that's related to uh, the dreaded discussion for every new author is voice and you're yeah, a lot of I remember especially when I was starting out like thinking this myself and then hearing other authors talk about you know editors always talk about voice and they talk about you need to have a good voice and an interesting voice and how do you get one of those and you realize as you go along you just write and it comes And I sometimes wonder if that's really what the through line ends up being is there's some element of your voice in everything that you do. And no matter how much you try to write something that's completely different, your voice is
Yeah,
still going to be there. So,
that's a curious question. Yeah. Um, I mean, I suppose I think I would agree with that. I think yeah, I don't know. I think writers um especially writers who read like a ton, they're they're using everything that they're taking in and distilling
yeah,
it through the self, right? And once you kind of become like you get out of that rote mode of writing and sort of get into where you start to feel comfortable and you're playing with words and all that, then you that's like I feel like when you start to develop the voice, but it's
yeah,
all distilling through the self and like the self is inherently and always a very unique thing. Um, yeah, so that seems right to me, I think.
yeah. It's always an interesting thing to watch people that are new to any writing craft, whether you're writing nonfiction or fiction or poetry or anything, even songwriting, that eventually you're going to have your own sort of spin on the world
Hmm.
and people will be able to recognize that even if you're
Yeah,
writing like different kinds of things or you change genres or whatever and
right.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally.
So I was wondering, I didn't hit you up with this ahead of time, so if you're not prepared, that's okay. But I can't remember if we talked about maybe if you would do a short reading from something that
Oh,
you,
totally. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
anything you want from any of the books, it's totally fine.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about uh the book, I'll read a few poems from the book. I'll try to go
Okay.
back to ones that
Yeah.
I'm particularly uncomfortable with. That'll be a good exercise for me.
I don't want to cause you any distress.
That's where I thrive.
Okay, well that's fair.
Let's see. I'll start with comfortable stuff first.
Okay, that sounds good.
So like I said earlier, this book has a bunch of little inventions poems that function as like section breaks kind of. Um, and so I like to kind of weave them in and out, but I'll read a couple of those and then I'll just read a couple poems and then maybe we'll do some sonnets. Since those are the most fun thing right now.
Okay.
Inventions. I invent a new type of missing. It is as light as morning. It comes back and back. It is on my shoulders like new hours and things to do. I wake up to flowers, but they bloomed for someone else. Inventions. I invent a love machine. You type yourself into it and wait, but nothing happens. You're on your deathbed. Everything is white. The paper, the keys. Picking apples. There's a really great orchard in Poughkeepsie where hearts grow. We walk the rows hand in hand, small talking below the beating that bobs the branch tips. They drip when it rains, go silver at night, grow silent. We walk row by row for many, many years until one day a murder of crows does what murders of crows do. Black feathers, a whole sky. This is not the life I'd imagined, I tell you. This slender line in a waste, this shadowy red sea, this soft, heavy rain that slips down and in and hurts sometimes and stops sometimes. Alice, are you hearing me? Holiday. The lake by your house in this memory makes a beautiful way to abandon the world. It's all I ever wanted to feel in historical acts, how the last light pricks the black pools of both eyes. We have finally let go the balloon. Alice, but the stars you see, they're sewing needles. Inventions. I invent a significant number of hummingbird murders, hang them from the low branches, hide them in leaves. I look up and they fall. I look down and the bones make no difference. How you regret as you live like your hands have seen nothing. Oh, this is the best inventions poem. Inventions. I invent taking pictures of refrigerator notes and sending them over the internet to coworkers. The last of the milk is all yours, for example. Or, I found your pond to be oddly swollen. Sometimes they politely reply, but most just do nothing. And that's when it happens. We all climb aboard the boat, but the boat is a voice in a cold spell. There's some fun, weird little language poems at the end of this. So I'll read a couple of these and then I'll maybe move on to some sonnets. Over the copse. I watch the hail, the way the hail, the way the hail would want to be watched on this porch in the woods with my cut paper parents. Breathing exercise. My real lungs are not inside my ribs, 100 tons of river. To hover ever so softly over everything is everything. I'll draw a breath, a ghost, a face, a petal from the rain to dry. Alice, oh Alice, my spine is coming loose.
Mhm.
I've been reading these sonnets at a bunch of the readings that I've been doing just because they're so much newer and so much more fun. So I have a habit of like reading a handful of poems out of the book that I'm supposed to be selling and then like moving on
And
to
saying,
different
well,
stuff.
these will be in the next book, so stay tuned.
Yeah, or like two or three books down the road, maybe. We'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
So these are sonnets, and I made all they're like collage poems. So I went through a couple really old, well, not really old, but pretty old notebooks, and cut lines out of the notebooks, and then like mix them around into new poems. And for anyone who doesn't know, a sonnet is just a 14 line poem. The lines are supposed to have 10 syllables. Mine generally don't-ish. Some of them do, but I'm calling them sonnets, so they're
Is
definitely
there
sonnets.
also a rhyming pattern? Isn't, if I remember way back in the days of English
So
lit?
there's different kinds of sonnets, I think.
Okay,
So
okay.
there's like Shakespearean sonnets and other
That's the
kinds
one
of
that
sonnets.
I would have learned about. So yeah, oops, sorry.
These are not those. These are just,
Okay.
these are the whatever sonnets. I'll just read a few of these. Field of vision. The sky floats on a lake, and what I am changes. Everything in this line is made of the same ingredients. Photons wriggle in me and you, then wriggle out. The moon, not as bright as that which it brightens. Frogs in a huge field croak my brother, who, like me, has big hands of glass. Mirrors of the forest. We coated our house in sleep. Went to Mukilteo, where dim rats dressed for business. One man crosses the lake in balloons, another contained in a curse. I am on the opposite shore of my life. Whoever dreamed this up has bad aesthetics. We ought to let the sorries fly. Electronically speaking, we all go cold. I hear you boil water and love you. I suspect this is practice for being missed. Sonnet for the Big Bang. I've made several attempts at the margins of my thoughts. In a dream, I ducked careening fabric, my jacket too tight like the seawater is, Every night I ask you who taught you sleeping. I ask for a long pole to poke the stars with. Horrible, hormone, horoscope. I regret ever actualizing most memories, how I arrange my shirts like steel bars of the soul, my knee cracks open and winter escapes. The quiet pasture, scuttled with maples, just one more poem to enter the day. I hear you boil water, and what I am changes. Little red flower, a sorry of the grass, it's so big now, it's completely vanished.
I'm gonna get a drink. I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure.
Ah, apologies, everyone.
No worries.
Interrupts a good poem with coughing. I like,
Okay.
I thought, uh, whenever I listen to a poem, I think that's going to take me a while. Like it's hard to have, I always find it hard to have an initial reaction because there's like so much going on that you want to, that you want to think about.
Yeah, and like I don't even know what's happening in these like newer poems. It'll probably take me,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
year to figure out what's going on, but
When you're crafting a poem, is it really just like you have like you're writing a sonnet, so you have a form that you're roughly being guided by.
hmm
Is at that point, is it just moving words around until it feels right? Or is there different what's
Um
the actual practice look like for you?
for me with for me with anything, like the sound always comes first.
Mm,
Um so when I'm like making sonnets out of lines that I've already written and then completely pulled out of context, um I'm looking I think I'm looking for like interesting sounds, but also interesting like juxtapositions and
mhm.
surprises.
Yeah.
Um, really more than I am like any kind of coherence, I guess. Um, and serendipitously, like coherences happen. And coherences happen, I think, too, because of like decoherences. Um, it's its own kind of sense making. But certainly, like there are poems that I made in using those, making those sonnets that just makes so little sense that they don't work. And they sound nice or whatever. They have like a nice mouth feel or something like that, but they don't work. But yeah, as long as I can remember my times writing poems, sound always comes before anything for me. So like, do these words feel nice when I say them together? If I'm straight up like composing, that sounds really pretentious. If I'm writing a poem, a lot of the times I'll have like a pre-verbal framework that I'm trying to fit in. So like I'll have a particular sound or rhythm or scansion or something in my mind, and I'm like just filling
Yeah.
words into it that fit into it. And maybe they make like an image, maybe they don't. I don't know.
I find that really fascinating because I know that for me, like trying to write poetry, like I'm too literal, you know.
hmm
It always ends up being like, look at the pretty, pretty green frog, Isn't it pretty? And I think what makes poems transcend that is just when they mean something that you're not sure, but you can feel like it means. I don't even know how to explain it. Like I listen to you read poems and I've listened to like Armin read his poems and that kind of thing. And it's like you're like trying to grab onto something and it's a little bit slippery, but you want to listen to it again because you know there's something there that's like feels really meaningful. And then there'll be a line or two that that I'll be like, oh, that's really cool. And I don't know, it's like it becomes bigger than the lines of words that you're trying to get your hands around.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
super
think in some
interesting.
ways that's what makes them so, it's like the Emily Dickinson quote where, you know it's a poem when it makes you, I can't remember exactly what she says, when you feel it peels off the
Yeah.
top of your head or something like that. I
Yeah,
can't
I know
remember.
what you're talking about.
But
Yeah.
uh but I've always really identified with that quote that I can't remember because it's like you feel something that really just captures your imagination, but you can't even quite put your finger on it. And
Right, yeah, right. And I think that like that's why I think I'm really attracted to writing in like a more surrealist mode because I feel like that's the place where I enjoy reading the most when like I know that it's doing something to me, emotionally or aesthetically or whatever, imagistically, but I can't exactly place what it is, you know?
yeah,
And for me at least, when that happens, it provides me like a container to not necessarily to put anything into it, because if you put anything into it, then it's meaningless. But to place into it, sort of my own meaning making, I guess.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and then it's like I get to participate. Like that's the thing that I've always really appreciated about Armin, is that Armin doesn't like pin a poem to the wall and tell me, what it's about or give me what it's about,
yeah,
but he gives me enough like looseness to help me make the poem with him. And he's a genius at that. Um, yeah, and I think that that's what I like about poetry generally, um, and why I tend to move into more surrealist places
yeah.
typically when I'm reading too. I feel like that
I
provides a
I
really nice.
like that quote of make the poem with him or with the writer because
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like I definitely kind of am drawn to that.
Hmm.
Um, like there's some of Mary Oliver's work that's not quite as surreal. It's more just, like the wild geese one for example. That one for me is just like taking a feeling and sort of expressing it in a way that is a little bit different, but I can get my head around that pretty good and I know what she means.
Right.
Uh, but I think that the more surrealist poems, it's like they kind of invite you to grapple with whatever meaning making you're gonna put into it. And it can be
Totally.
different
Yeah.
for everybody. So
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like a real slippery slope too. There's a Robert Lowell quote, and I'm gonna totally botch it.
that's okay. I
But it
just botched Emily Dickinson. So
but it's something like surrealism can degenerate into like clinical meaninglessness. Um, and I think that that's so true. Like, there's got to be some kernel of something in there that's entirely graspable and like
Mhm.
entirely rooted in reality. Um, a good friend of mine always tells me that the surreal can only exist against the backdrop of the real. And
Oh,
I
that's
feel
nice. I
like,
like that.
yeah, yeah, right. Like it makes total sense. Um, but it's like, you can just get wildly surreal and then everything sort of loses all its meaning. And then you get like, the sound without the substance.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, which is like an easy territory to move into, especially when you're doing like really off the wall stuff.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I think one thing that I noticed in both of those sonnets was the reference to the making the tea on the stove.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
there is a point of like an image that I can grab onto and then like, okay, how do I extrapolate out from that? Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. And like those bits of dailiness, I feel
Yeah.
like one of the weirdest things you can do in a poem is just like talk about the thing that's directly in front of you. Really literally right there in front of you.
Yeah.
And it just brings in some element of strangeness that is strange because it's not strange.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Or
you can
does it
touch it.
feel poetic, but
Right,
suddenly it
exactly.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You just change the context and it's like, it's great.
Yeah. Well, I could probably talk about this all night, but I should probably tie up. But I was going to ask you actually, to close up here is, of course, we hope you all come in and buy Will's books at the store. But I also wanted to do a shout out to the folks at Birdhouse, and anybody who is interested in poetry beyond like reading it, like writing it, being able to experience spoken word poetry live, and all of that. Birdhouse is a wonderful place in our community where that's happening on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they're still, I think they're still doing classes with Christopher Luna on a
They're
fairly regular
doing
basis.
they're doing
Um,
the work with Chris Luna every first Friday when they do like the art walk down
oh
there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
They pretty consistently have like readings starting at like 7 on those first Fridays that they do. So yeah, they're really building a
Yeah.
little community down there that's really
I
beautiful.
love that they've like come in and grabbed that niche and really, really done a good job with it.
Yeah,
So
totally.
if you want used poetry, we have two full bookcases and we've got some new poetry. But if you want to hang out with poets and learn poetry yourself, you need to check out Birdhouse Books. They are downtown Vancouver, I believe Evergreen in Maine. I'm pretty
Evergreen in
sure.
Maine, yeah.
Or
In the
Evergreen in
basement.
Broadway, one of the two.
Right, right,
Look for the bubble tea shop. They're downstairs.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Get your bubble tea, you go downstairs. But anyway, yeah. So I just wanted to be sure to note that because I think that you're just doing a really fun thing in the community for people who are interested in poetry. So
Yeah.
but thank you again so much, Will. I do not know how this is going to end up being on YouTube, uh, because it's still telling me that it's not working, but it says it's been streaming for however many minutes. So I will go and figure that out after we get done. But in some way, shape, or form, this will pop up for people to watch the replay. Um, but I really appreciate you being here tonight and talking with me, and I'm excited about your new book and all the other new books and
Thank you
that are
so
going to
much.
happen because you've got material, it sounds like, for your thesis to last you about
We'll
20
see.
more books.
We'll see. We'll see if I make it through. I don't
Okay.
know. Well, thank you so much. It's always these talks are so fun. Um, yeah, I just really appreciate it, and I appreciate you guys, and yeah, just a lot of gratitude for you. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you. Well, have a wonderful evening and we'll talk to you